If it's Thursday, former Congressman and MAGA firebrand Matt Gaetz withdraws from consideration as President-elect Trump's Attorney General, as Justice Department officials breathe a sigh of release. And the Trump transition team goes back to the drawing board. Plus, Trump's pick for defense secretary plays defense, making the rounds on Capitol Hill to build support among Senate Republicans as a police report surfaces containing graphic new details of alleged sexual misconduct, allegations he denies. And sources tell NBC News that Trump is planning a flurry of executive orders when he takes office to set in motion his promise of mass deportations as the new administration gets ready to test the limits of its power on day one. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Yamiche Alcindor in Washington. We begin with breaking news from the Trump transition. The president-elect's pick for Attorney General, former Congressman Matt Gaetz, has withdrawn from consideration. The news coming as House Democrats were pushing for a vote on releasing a potentially damning ethics report into Gaetz' alleged sexual misconduct and illicit drug use. Today, Gaetz announced his withdrawal via social media, saying his confirmation, quote, was unfairly becoming a distraction. The news sent shockwaves through Capitol Hill, and it came just a day after Gaetz, alongside Vice President-elect J.D. Vance, lobbied Republicans on the Hill to support his confirmation, and as Trump was personally working the phones as well. Here's Gaetz just last night expressing optimism.
The Senator's been giving me a lot of good advice. I'm looking forward to a hearing. Folks have been very supportive. They've been saying we're going to get a fair process. So it's a great day of momentum for the Trump-Vance administration.
Today, the president-elect thanked Gaetz on social media, writing, quote, I greatly appreciate the recent efforts of Matt Gaetz in seeking approval to be Attorney General. He was doing very well, but at the same time did not want to be a distraction for the administration, for which he has much respect. The withdrawal raises questions about who Mr. Trump will choose as his next pick for Attorney General, and what the failed bid might mean for some of the president-elect's other polarizing choices. Those choices include his pick to lead the Department of Defense, Pete Hegseth. Today, the Fox News personality joined Vice President-elect J.D. Vance on Capitol Hill to petition Senate Republicans to confirm him. Those meetings come as we're learning new details about a 2017 sexual assault allegation against the Fox News host. Hegseth was not charged in connection with the alleged assault, but documents released by the Monterey, California Police Department are providing insight into those allegations by a California woman identified as Jane Doe. She told police in graphic detail that after the two met at a Republican women's conference, Hegseth took her phone, physically blocked her from leaving the hotel room, and sexually assaulted her. Hegseth told police he had sex with Jane Doe, but that the encounter was consensual. Speaking today on Capitol Hill, Hegseth again denied the allegations of assault and pointed to the fact that he was not charged.
Did you sexually assault a woman in Monterey, California?
I have, as far as the media is concerned, it's very simple. The matter was fully investigated, and I was completely clear, and that's probably.
To be clear, police did not give a reason for charging Hegseth. Today on the Hill, several Republican senators pointed to the lack of charges as they voiced support for Mr. Trump's choice.
I think he's going to be in pretty good shape.
Did you talk about the allegations in the police report, the sexual assault allegations?
We weren't specific, but, since no charges were brought by the authorities, we have only the press reports.
I believe his story. I believe where Pete's at on this thing, and I'm going to be pushing to get him confirmed.
It's a disgrace that those allegations are nothing but what you said, allegations that are he said, she said. This is a case that has been dismissed. This is just dredging up something to try to smear and discredit a candidate.
Let me bring in our team of reporters to cover all this news. Vaughn Hillyard is in West Palm Beach covering the Trump transition. Ryan Nobles is on Capitol Hill, and Ken Dilanian has the latest reaction from the Justice Department. So, Vaughn, I want to start with you. President-elect Trump thanked Gaetz on social media, but I wonder, was there an effort by Trump or the team to encourage Gaetz to do this, to withdraw from the nomination? And I wonder what this reporting of a second alleged encounter with this minor at that 2017 party if that pushed this over the edge, changed the dynamic of things, Vaughn?
Right. It's not clear if that allegation of that second sexual encounter ultimately spurred Gaetz to back out or not, or whether it was the potential acknowledgement that there were multiple senators who were going to ultimately block his bid for the nomination. Was that the last pin for him to drop, in a realization that it was going to be not a fruitful 2 months ahead for him before those confirmation hearings and proceedings were to move forward? Look, for Matt Gaetz, this is, of course, was going to be an opportunity to be the lead prosecutor for the Department of Justice, a big career opportunity, you could make the case, and somebody who has been a no more staunch political ally to Donald Trump than really anybody else up on Capitol Hill. But this is even a greater defeat for Donald Trump, the president-elect. It showed that there was at least part of the Senate that was willing to block his top pick for a very significant position. And for him, this is a moment in time where we are still, again, 2 months out from Inauguration Day, and still plenty of other controversial picks, from Tulsi Gabbard to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to Vance Hegseth, who he has put forward here over the last days, and are going to face that same level of scrutiny and challenges up on Capitol Hill.
Yeah. Well, when you talk about the fact that this is sort of a defeat for President-elect Trump, I wonder, where does the search go from here when it comes to getting a new AG, someone who's going to be as loyal as Matt Gaetz? And I also wonder, because the president-elect said that Gaetz has a, quote, wonderful future ahead, could we see Gaetz go somewhere else in this Trump administration that maybe doesn't require a Senate confirmation?
There's hundreds and thousands of other political appointee positions that do not require a Senate confirmation. So he very well could wind up either at the Department of Justice or at the White House or in some other department or agency. But I think for Donald Trump, this is the difficulty here compared to 8 years ago, when he was looking this go around to fill his cabinet and top administration posts. He made it very clear that he wanted to ensure that loyal individuals who would carry out his agenda, whether it be at the DOJ or at the Pentagon or at or at Health and Human Services, that he was going to have people that he could rely on in these roles. And naturally, when that is a commitment that you want these individuals who you're going to nominate to make to you, that pool of individuals becomes even smaller. And so, of course, he put forward Todd Blanche to be his deputy attorney general, and he could very well be alternatively picked to be the AG. But you also have people like Mark Paoletta, who is an attorney who has been helping out this transition process, who is not as well publicly known, may not be outwardly as bombastic, yet could also carry out the idea that the Department of Justice under a Donald Trump presidency shouldn't be this independent entity from the executive branch of the White House here. And so I think for Donald Trump, of course, it is not clear exactly who his alternative is at this time, yet we know that there is no reason to believe that he will not pick somebody who he deems to be almost just as loyal and ready to carry out this idea that they want to take out the deep state, so he calls it, inside of the Department of Justice, and somebody who is willing to take on his perceived enemies through potential investigations.
Yeah, and he has a number of other people to choose from. Now, Ryan, I saw you in the video. You were chasing lawmakers today, as you always do so well. What was the reaction to this Gaetz withdrawal on Capitol Hill, and were lawmakers surprised?
Surprised, I think. Yamiche is a bit of an understatement. It seemed to catch everybody in this building off guard. In many ways, it seemed as though a bomb was dropped here, especially because the Trump transition seems so intent on trying to find a path to confirmation for Matt Gaetz. And Matt Gaetz seemed so positive when he left here last night about the round of meetings that he had with these senators. But listen to how they responded when, in many ways, we informed them of the news that Gaetz was no longer the nominee.
I'm surprised. At this point, I think Matt's smart. He would change the way the DOJ had done it. I think what Matt decided to do here was a decision he had to come to, and it was probably a positive decision for the administration.
What I think it probably reflects is the meetings that he had yesterday with senators. I think that he has put country first, and I'm pleased with his decision.
And what we're hearing, my colleague Julie Sirkin and myself and others, is that he was basically in a position where the math just was not adding up. There was far more than just the 4 senators that he could potentially lose in a confirmation vote that were not willing to vote yes for his appointment as the next Attorney General. And despite the fact that he had made this outreach, that the president-elect himself had made that outreach, that the vice president-elect J.D. Vance was here with him to try and make that outreach, that many of these members were just immovable forces. They just could not see their way to voting yes for Matt Gaetz. And Yamiche, I do have to say, I think it is an indication of just what type of Republican Senate we may be dealing with here in this new Congress. This was something that Donald Trump wanted, and at least at this stage, they were telling him no, which is an indication they may be willing to say no to him in the future as well.
Yeah, definitely a window into the dynamics. Now, when I heard this news, I had this thought that sounded wild in my own head, but then we talked to the team here and other people had that same question, which is Matt Gaetz, Ryan, has already resigned from Congress. He said he doesn't intend to serve his next term, though he was reelected. But can he unresign, Ryan?
So I've been asking this question myself. You were not, it was not ridiculous that you posed that question, Yamiche. I think many people are asking that. I was in contact with his team today, and they told me that he is not even thinking about the next stage of his life, that he's, still dealing with the fact that this nomination quest has come to an end, and he's still evaluating what steps are remaining. But he made it pretty clear in his statement to the Speaker in his letter of resignation that he did not intend on being seated in the next Congress. I don't think there's not a legal reason why he couldn't change his mind. And if he changed his mind up until the date of the swearing in, where he could theoretically be seated. But I do think the practical possibility of that is very small. You have to remember, one of the big reasons he left Congress was because of this looming ethics report. And the only reason that did not see the light of day was because he resigned Congress. If he decided to be sworn back in, that investigation would fire right back up again. And there's a very good chance, even if he's not the potential Attorney General nominee, that we'd see that report come to light.
Really important to mention that report. Vaughn, of course, all of this comes as J.D. Vance was literally back on Capitol Hill again with yet another polarizing pick, trying to get support for that. This, of course, being Pete Hegseth. Does Matt Gaetz withdrawing cause more problems for someone like Pete Hegseth or maybe even Tulsi Gabbard, or does it pave the way for their confirmations?
I actually think, to Ryan's point exactly, is that it shows a willingness among some of these Republican senators to buck Donald Trump's wishes, and that they're going to truly carry out the advise and consent role that constitutionally the Senate has been obligated to play. And that's where, for Pete Hegseth, his visit to Capitol Hill is so prudent, because there are reasons in which these Republican senators, including a great many of them that are going to be outgoing in just a few years' time, some of them also, like Bill Cassidy and Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, they actually voted to convict Donald Trump after January 6th. So they've already been on the side of Donald Trump's ire. And so there's really, at this point in time, especially with the fact that Donald Trump most likely would not be running for president again 4 years from now, they have, political capital themselves in which they are able to put some handcuffs potentially on who Donald Trump is placing. Because like in the likes of Pete Hegseth, who is facing the serious allegation of a sexual assault from 2017, there is also questions, though, about him. He served as, yes, a decorated combat veteran, but he's never led one of the branches of the military or had a leadership role in the Pentagon. And so I think that this is only draws more attention to people like Tulsi Gabbard and RFK, and the extent to which they will need to convince these particularly Republican senators that they are worthy of confirmation.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much to Vaughn and to Ryan for all that great reporting. And Ken, you've been patiently standing by because you are, of course, covering the building where people were waiting to see what happened here. So there was a lot of concern at the DOJ about this choice for Matt Gaetz as Attorney General. What's been the reaction to the Justice Department today's news? And is there a sort of sense of relief here?
100%, Yamiche. We are getting messages expressing incredible relief. This is a great weight off the shoulders of many people over there. They were absolutely horrified by this pick, in part because the Justice Department had investigated Gaetz. There were actually prosecutors over there who built that investigative file filled with damaging information about Matt Gaetz, and they were facing the prospect that he would be their boss. And there's a whole unit that investigates sex trafficking of minors. It just was mind-boggling. But then you leave all that aside, and you get the fact that he had never really practiced much law, had never had a job even remotely similar to running a large bureaucracy. The Attorney General is not only the top legal officer, he or she is a very important national security figure, receiving very sensitive intelligence that the president gets. So they are really relieved, but they're also very concerned now about what comes next. And we're really at a crossroads here because Donald Trump has elevated his defense lawyer, Todd Blanche, to be the deputy attorney general, which is really an important job. It's like the chief operating officer. And Todd Blanche, while he did defend Donald Trump and he criticized the special counsel investigations, he is well regarded inside the building. He worked there. He was a prosecutor in the Southern District. He's a real lawyer. And he doesn't believe the nutty conspiracy theories that hold that the FBI, somehow corruptly framed Donald Trump. He knows that's not true. So the question is, will Donald Trump appoint someone who thinks like Todd Blanche or someone who thinks like Matt Gaetz? And there's been some names floating around that run the gamut. A guy named Mike Davis, who's advising the transition team, tweeted today, and he offered some names, one of which is Mark Paoletta, who does seem more in the Gaetz camp. And then there's a guy named Chris Landau, who is the ambassador to Mexico in the Trump administration, who went to Harvard, is at a mainstream law firm, and who seems more like he's in the Todd Blanche camp. So that's the big question right now. DOJ officials very concerned about what comes next here and what it says about the direction the Trump administration wants to take the Justice Department.
Yeah, so even though Matt Gaetz is gone, there's a lot of bracing for what might come next, maybe even some horror that might come next if they're worried about the next pick. Well, thank you so much, Ken, for all your reporting.
You bet.
And let me now bring in Congressman Glenn Ivey, a Democrat from Maryland and a member of the House Ethics Committee. Thank you so much, Congressman, for being here. So Gaetz is no longer in consideration for Attorney General. What was your reaction to this withdrawal, and what happens now to the Ethics Committee report that you and your colleagues have been working on?
Well, the withdrawal surprised me almost as much as the initial selection. And there have been a lot of surprises in between, too. So it's been an interesting tale. As far as what comes next, I'm not sure, frankly. As your commentators just alluded to a moment ago, there is the potential that he could change his mind about not pursuing the congressional seat that he was elected or reelected to. There are also other possibilities. If Marco Rubio is selected for the cabinet and confirmed, it may be that he could be named to fill out that term. I've also seen speculation that he might run for governor in 2026 in Florida. So I don't really know what's up next for him. I guess we'll just have to see.
When you talk about what all those positions, those elected official positions that could be up next, do you think the public then still deserves to see this ethics report? And will you push to make it public?
Well, the House Ethics Committee does have precedent for releasing reports even after a member of Congress has resigned and left office. And I know that there may be some scenarios where that was done in part because the individual was considering seeking additional office or running for office. I want to say that was the Bonner case. I want to say that was around 1987, if I recall correctly. So I think that's still a possibility.
Yeah.
How the committee will, or if the committee will consider that, I'm not sure, but I think we'll have to see. But as far as I know, the December 5th meeting is still on the books, and we'll see how it goes.
I guess I want to go back to, do you think you yourself will be out there saying we should publish this report? And do you think the full House should also take up this matter?
Well, I think it contains information that the public should have, especially if he does decide to pursue additional office, whether it's the congressional seat, a Senate seat, a gubernatorial seat, a different kind of appointment to the Trump administration. I think the public should see that information. And I know in some other prior occasions, the fact that, the potentially material that could be relevant to larger debates about how we pursue cases, whether it's at the Ethics Committee level, the Department of Justice, there might be some light to shed on that too. I can't go into details there, but that's another consideration. I'm sorry, what was your other question?
No, that was the question. And I think when you talk about the fact that you can't go into too much detail, there was this sort of public tensions that we saw between House committee ethics members. What have the last few days been like inside that committee?
Yeah, I can't really talk about the internal deliberations, but I think you've seen some of the external statements that have been made after those meetings by the chairman, Mr. Gaetz, and the ranking member, Ms. Wild. And, there were some, tense exchanges there. So, but, that can come with the territory. I think, these are matters that can sometimes raise strong feelings. But, our ethics committee has had a good record of working together, back to the Santos investigation, for example. And I hope that we'll be able to do that in the future moving forward.
Yeah. Another thing that's interesting is that Matt Gaetz was already the subject of a House investigation when Donald Trump chose him. I wonder, do you think that given now that he's not subject to this, that it makes it possibly easier for other controversial picks to get through because now he's sort of maybe even seen as the sacrificial lamb of all this?
I don't know. I think it does shift the spotlight, though, to other nominees. Gaetz was sucking up the oxygen with respect to the nominee for Department of Defense and Tulsi Gabbard, for the national security post. I think they'll get more scrutiny now than they were, while his nomination was pending.
Yeah.
And that's probably rightly so. I think they both have very, questionable things in their backgrounds that the Senate and certainly the public should consider carefully before they elevate either of them to those kinds of positions. And there's other nominees too that President-elect Trump has sent up that are kind of head scratchers, frankly. So I think we'll just have to see how that plays out. But it's clear that he's not having a strong and thorough vetting process before he makes some of these selections. And so I think that makes it even more incumbent on the Senate and the public to pay close attention and, do the vetting for him.
Yeah. Well, I also want to ask you about what happens in January when President-elect Trump takes office. Republicans will have this razor-thin majority, but a majority nonetheless. That being said, I wonder how you and other House Democrats plan to govern in the minority.
Well, we'll probably do more of the same. We're in the minority now, and, our leader, Hakeem Jeffries, has done an outstanding job of managing us and keeping us unified and working together and moving together. And we've had great strength in our solidarity there. So we'll have to see. But, in this current Congress, the stuff that really had to get done was based on the leadership of Hakeem Jeffries, whether that was keeping the government open, which we've done on a couple of occasions, making sure the United States pays its debts and doesn't default on those. That was Hakeem Jeffries' leadership that made those happen. And we'll continue to work with the Republicans where we can and maintain our principles. But if they're going to cross lines and support the types of things that we've seen so far, or potentially Project 2025 proposals, we'll stand against those and fight those.
Yeah, and you say it really interesting, and you talk about the idea that you made sure that things that needed to get done got done. So with that said, do you see a scenario where Democrats will help Republicans if legislation stalls?
We've already done that. And, those two examples I cited, but there have been others too.
Yeah.
But, I think the key is not so much are we going to bail out the Republicans, but what are we going to do to make sure that the American public gets what it needs done by the government? And we're definitely willing to make sure that those things happen. We'll stand to make sure that, the government moves forward, that we get the things done that the American people need.
Well, Congressman Glenn Ivey, I really, really appreciate you coming on a newsy Thursday.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And more reaction to Gaetz' withdrawal and what it means is ahead. Coming up, what's next for Pete Hegseth and the Pentagon as Trump's embattled pick for defense secretary fights back against sexual misconduct allegations while fighting for Senate support. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. As Pete Hegseth makes his case to senators for why he's best suited to lead the Department of Defense, sources tell NBC News the Trump transition team is stepping up their search for a deputy defense secretary. The move is reportedly intended to push back on criticism that Hegseth doesn't have the qualifications for the role. Hegseth has also been a frequent critic of the Department of Defense. He has said he wants to see the military purged of, quote, woke officials, and he has said he believes women should not serve in combat. Last night, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley, a frequent target of Trump, lashed out.
Don't lecture me about women in combat. Women have been in combat, and it doesn't matter if that 7.62 hits you in the chest. No one gives a shit if it's a woman or a guy who pulled that trigger. You're still dead. It doesn't matter if you're white, if you're black, if you're a man, if you're a woman, if you're a Catholic, if you're a Protestant. None of those identification things matter. What matters are standards, readiness standards. Do you meet the standard or not? If yes, pass go, collect 200, join the infantry.
But some members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, which will consider the nomination first, dismissed the comments. Yesterday, North Dakota Senator Kevin Cramer told me Hegseth is allowed to have a personal opinion. Take a listen.
That's his personal position. He certainly earned the right to have it, at being an American, and even more so being an American warrior as he's been. So I don't find that as controversial as some people may. He's a great face, frankly, for a modern American military. He oozes peace through strength, and that's exactly what Donald Trump wants.
And joining me now is Helene Cooper, Pentagon correspondent at the New York Times. Helene, great to see you. I want to start with these questions around Hegseth on experience. As someone who covers the Pentagon, you've been there a while. What has been the mood there about a potential defense secretary, Hegseth?
Hi, Amish. It's nice to see you. I see you guys are still having to bleep out Milley. He's talking. The mood at the Pentagon is just, the reaction has not been great, as you can expect. Women in particular, I mean, the United States military has hundreds of thousands of women who serve, and many, we have a lot more women in combat now than we did, say, 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 40 or 50 years ago, which is where a lot of people think that Pete Hegseth's views of women in combat sort of belong. You can make that by applying his logic. You could easily apply that same logic to blacks, minorities in combat, who serve in the military. So that sort of seems to a lot of women in combat as crazy. When you look at the Pentagon, I think it's not just the issue of where his thoughts are about the Pentagon being too woke, for instance, which is really rich when you're talking about one of the most conservative institutions in the American government. It's almost a Tea Party demographic, but this whole idea that the Pentagon is woke has been one that's been a very big Trump talking point for years now. And you have this this hard right narrative that's been pushed by a lot of Republicans, people like Matt Gaetz, for instance, who complain that the Pentagon is too woke because they say they shouldn't have renamed bases that were named after Confederate generals. For instance, they shouldn't be promoting promoting the whole idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Pete Hegseth has even taken a shot at the Black African American chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General C.Q. Brown, who's an Air Force fighter pilot with hundreds of combat flying hours under his belt, because he's angry that General Brown made a video after the George Floyd protests talking about his experiences with racism in his 40-year military career. So this is the guy who President-elect Trump is proposing come into the Pentagon. This is a Pentagon that's 43% minority to begin with of the enlisted men and women. You have men, women, African Americans, you have Latinos, you have everybody anybody under the sun serving in this American military. And President-elect Trump is proposing a very divisive candidate to put at the top. So,
well, with that being said, you think about the divisiveness of this and sort of how he's being viewed. What kind of guardrails are there within the command and control structure of the military as the Trump administration prepares to take office? Because it's a big question. And I know, of course, you having worked in and understanding the Pentagon for so much of your time there, that you understand sort of the guardrails there. So what are they?
There are a lot of guardrails. For instance, one of the things that President Trump's allies and allies of Pete Hegseth, for instance, are talking about is court-martialing people who were involved in the Afghanistan evac. The American military, though, is run in a chain of command type structure, and the president is the commander-in-chief. President-elect Trump, when he was last president, is the one who negotiated the initial terms of the American evacuation from Afghanistan. He's the one who came up with the agreement with the Taliban to begin with for the United States to evacuate. And now they're talking about going after the generals and people who were involved in this, what was in truth a botched evacuation. But this is all coming from a commander-in-chief. You can't go and you can't prosecute the people who take commands from the commander-in-chief if you don't, for something like this, if you don't first go after the people who gave the command to begin with. So there are guardrails in place, and they're in place because the military is very much a top-down type structure where you're supposed to follow all lawful, and lawful being the right term here, orders of your chain, that come down during your chain of command. The other kind of big guardrail, I would say, would just be the size of the military to begin with. This is of the Pentagon to begin with. You're looking at a budget of $900 billion a year. You're looking at an employee calculus of 3 million people. It's a really big institution, and that's a hard institution with entrenched legal structures and bureaucratic structures. That's going to be a really hard institution to really unravel. So it'll be interesting to see whether Pete Hegseth has the ability to do all that he's talking about doing.
Yeah, well, Helene Cooper, thank you so much for your reporting. It reminds me of why I would sit at your desk when I was at the New York Times and listen to your brilliance. So thank you so much.
We need to do this some more.
I appreciate it. And turning now to the White House, these are live pictures right now of President Biden welcoming the Boston Celtics to the White House South Lawn to celebrate the basketball team's NBA championship. The Celtics, of course, made history back in June when they won their 18th championship, a league record, against the Dallas Mavericks. Today's visit comes a day before the Celtics take on the Wizards here in Washington. Of course, my family, I'm sure, is very happy from being from Boston. So we'll be right back here watching Meet the Press now.
Now, I have voted for almost everybody's nominees. And I can promise you, when a Democrat nominates somebody, I don't have this problem of walking down the hall with a microphone in my face. The double standard is atrocious, and it needs to stop.
Folks always want to get ahead of the process. There's a process, and that's why, we go through the process, get all the information, and work through it as well as we can.
Welcome back. That was some of the reaction from Senate Republicans to today's surprise news that Matt Gaetz was withdrawing from consideration for Attorney General. For more on all this news, I'm joined by Tia Mitchell, Washington Bureau Chief for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, at 11, former Democratic Congressman from Michigan, and now a distinguished senior fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. And Mark Short is also with us, former Chief of Staff to Vice President Mike Pence, and now a Meet the Press contributor. So thank you all for being here. Tia, I want to start with you, or actually, maybe I should start with Mark, actually, which is, Mark, we were just talking during the commercial break. You thought maybe Matt Gaetz might last a little bit longer than he did. Why do you think he's withdrawing today?
Well, I think typically if you nominate a sex predator to be Attorney General of the United States, it's not going to end up too well. And I think that was just the nature of where this was likely to end up. I do think that the Trump team wanted to fight it longer, but, I think that this is also a setback in other reasons, because you have senators who have now gone out on a limb and said they would support him. You had conservative groups who said they would fundraise for him. And I think to the president's, signaling that he wants recess appointments it will give even more caution to any senators who would entertain that, because they now look at it like, if this is who's going to be nominated during a recess, I'm more reluctant to agree to have a recess.
Yeah. If that's the case, I wonder, do you think that when you see what's going on with Matt Gaetz, that we'll have a Trump administration with the, I guess what should I ask is, what do you think is Matt Gaetz' future, given the fact that he's a Trump loyalist, that he's someone that Trump himself is saying he has a wonderful future?
I don't know. I mean, I've read the reports he wants to run for governor, but I think if that was the case, this was a misstep, because if you think you're going to bury the report by resigning from Congress and doing this, by becoming a nominee, you also assured that report was going to come out in the confirmation hearing, and it's going to be hard to say that that's not going to come out if he runs for public office again.
Yeah.
But here's a question any person might have.
Well, first of all, I have to say Andy Levin, because clearly there's so much news that I called you Adam Levin. So Andy Levin, go ahead and jump in.
Well, is he going to take his seat or not? Right? He resigned the rest of this term, but he was just reelected. So if he takes his seat, then the investigation presumably continues.
I think what is maybe more likely is he get a different role in Trump's orbit, whether it's in the White House or in a lobbying firm that's friendly with the Trump administration, but a role that doesn't require confirmation.
Yeah. Well, I also want to ask this, which is, Tia, we don't see former President Trump, or I guess President-elect Trump, he doesn't get a lot of backlash from Republicans. This is a moment where Senate Republicans, even if they said it quietly, said, you're not getting this. What does that tell you about the future dynamics here?
I think it shows that there are at least a handful of senators. I don't know how many there were, and I think Matt Gaetz was an extreme case, but I think that shows that there are senators who are willing to stand up to Trump to say, no, we think it's too far. Now, the question is, does it take someone as extreme as Matt Gaetz to get those senators to stand up to Trump, or will they be willing to do it with other nominees that are problematic, but in ways that aren't so controversial, like your Tulsi Gabbards or your RFK Jr.?
Andy, I wonder, when you think about this and see what the Senate Republicans just did here, even if they did it quietly, that this gives you the idea that maybe they won't just be a rubber stamp on Donald Trump, or do we think that this is maybe an anomaly and that for the next 4 years, Trump will usually get what he wants?
You know, Yamisha, I have no idea. But what my uncle was the chair of the Armed Services Committee in the Senate for so long, or the ranking member, depending on who was in charge there. This idea of somebody as manifestly unqualified as Hegseth being the Secretary of Defense, right? I mean, let's see how it plays out. But I think these senators really have a lot to consider. With him, with Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, I served with her. She has no business being the Director of National Intelligence. I doubt Mark disagrees with that. I don't know.
What does that smile say, Mark?
Of course I agree. I mean, she's a lifelong Democrat till recent conversion, but she's somebody who has praised Assad. She's somebody who I think what's most troubling is not just her affection for Putin, but in fact that she's praised Edward Snowden and Julian Assange, which is people who have leaked American secrets and put our men and women in uniform in danger to be leading the intelligence community is quite startling.
And I should just note, as we talk about Matt Gaetz, these are allegations against Matt Gaetz. These are also allegations against Pete Hegseth. Nobody's been charged or convicted of anything. That being said, Mark, you're making the point of sort of there's concern about other picks. How concerned are you about the next pick for AG?
I don't, it's hard to know yet. I mean, I think there are people who would align with Republicans' wishes to see great reforms in the Department of Justice and to see a lot of changes made who are not necessarily predators of children. And so I think that there's a wide breadth of reasonable conservatives you could appoint to that position and still accomplish the same means. And I think it's actually been destructive to the president's intentions and desires, because you now have weakened your case on recess appointments too.
And I was just going to say, just to your point, I think the vast majority of Senate Republicans, probably nearly all Senate Republicans, want to help Trump build his team, want to give him the nominees that he desires, but they want him to make better choices. Yeah. So they're making difficult decisions because they do believe that their constituents back home, for the most part, are supportive of Trump's administration. But some of these nominees are considered so beyond kind of the scope of who you would consider for these various roles.
Yeah, well, I also want to ask you, if you think about that, should Pete Hegseth then be in fear of his nomination?
I think so. I mean, I think Pete Hegseth is going to run the risk of when he starts meeting with these senators, hearing the same thing that Matt Gaetz heard, but for possibly different reasons. But I think Pete Hegseth is going to find that there are a few Republicans, probably enough, to keep him from being confirmed.
So I also want to ask this, and I was thinking about this, Peter Baker of the New York Times pointed out in the New York Times that this week that Trump is defying the Me Too movement with cabinet picks facing accusations. Maybe I'll start with you, Mark. When do you think that Trump is sort of actively picking these people regardless of their backgrounds? Or do you think that this is in some ways indicative of the fact that these allegations against men, that they are maybe don't have the same potency because you have someone like President-elect Trump who had his own allegations against him. You had other people like Brett Kavanaugh also able to push back on those allegations.
I think we can read too much into it. I think it's more a function of a process that should be more deliberate. And when you just throw out names as quickly as you have without background checks or FBI background checks, I think that it leads to more problems.
What do you think, Andy?
You know, I really agree with Mark, and I also think it shows
too much of that today.
Well,
this is a lot of agreement.
This is what the MAGA movement is. You know, traditional Republicans and Democrats agree about national security and not putting like a tool, a seeming mouthpiece of Russian propaganda in to lead our national intelligence. This is really serious stuff, right, Yamiche? And I think that he's putting loyalty to him above all else and being good on TV or something. Lord knows I would never be picked for anything. But
well, you were picked to represent the people.
Well, by the people. I was picked by the people. I wouldn't be picked by Donald Trump.
Right. Well, Tia, I want to bring you in, which is that we had this Me Too moment. There are some who are wondering, has it peaked, or is it not going to have the same potency? Or when you see someone like Matt Gaetz, who of course is withdrawing, people would say it's likely in connection to these allegations that there is some potency here, and that maybe Donald Trump and some people who can defy them are still an anomaly here.
I think in Trump world particularly, it doesn't have the same pull, particularly when someone doesn't get charged with crimes. But even after, charges, he wasn't charged with the crime, but Trump was found liable in a civil suit. Again, it didn't bring him down in a presidential election. That's with the general electorate of the United States. So I think, unfortunately, if it doesn't involve someone underage, but even with Matt Gaetz, there is someone underage. If it doesn't involve also video or something hard evidence where people really see, I think, unfortunately, when people want to believe the other person and not the accuser, they find themselves creating pathways to do so. Yeah. And I don't think that has to do with politics. Unfortunately, that's part of our American culture.
Yeah, well, definitely a lot to think about as we think through all of these nominees and the way forward. So thank you so much to Tia and Andy, to Mark. And after the break, the Trump transition team gets its day one priorities ready, telling NBC News that the president-elect's executive actions will be, quote, like nothing you've seen. We've got the details. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. As President-elect Trump forges ahead with filling out key posts within his administration, NBC News has new reporting about what day one of Mr. Trump's second term will look like. Transition officials tell NBC News that aides plan to roll out a flurry of executive actions aligned with campaign promises on the military and immigration for Trump to sign on his very first day in office. And joining me now is NBC News Digital senior White House reporter Peter Nicholas, who had this great reporting. So, Peter, what are you hearing from Trump officials about these executive actions that will happen on day one, and what will they include?
Well, we may see as many as half a dozen executive orders dealing with immigration alone. This is a much faster pace than we saw in 2016. And Trump is trying to make good on the promise that he's going to seal up the border. He's going to begin the process of deporting people who are living here illegally, with a focus on those who might represent national security threats. So he's going to convey a sense of action and purpose, all consistent with his campaign promises. And
when you think about that, you're thinking about campaign promises. He talked about literally ending the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East at warp speed, he said. Yes. Are those foreign policy issues still a top sort of concern of his when you think about all the stuff that he's saying about mass deportations and all the other things? Is foreign policy still at the top of mind?
Certainly. There's some concern that this approach may be too scattershot. We talked to Newt Gingrich, for example, former House Speaker and a close Trump ally, who said if you try to do too much, you may find yourself failing to enact some of the core promises. So he mentioned tax reform, which is another promise, which could, which also requires some focus. But yes, I mean, ending the war in Ukraine and Gaza is going to be a priority, but that's a diplomatic measure. That's something that's going to take some time. But you'll see movement on that quickly on the diplomatic front.
Yeah. I also want to ask you, it's interesting, you talk about all the movement that's going to happen. Trump walks in as a lame duck. I wonder how much that impacts his pace and his sense of urgency.
Well, I think that's exactly right, Yamiche, that in 2026, we're going to be moving, Congress's focus is going to be on the midterm elections. So there's really only a year and a half window for him to take advantage of his high political capital and try to execute this agenda. So, and then, before we know it, people will be looking at 2028 when Trump can't run again. So this is his window where he really has to make good on these promises. And that's why I think you're going to see movement on so many fronts.
Yeah. And it's interesting when you think about sort of the movement that you're going to see. Do you think that Democrats are going to have sort of the wherewithal to push back on any of this? Or because they're executive orders, it's just going to happen?
I think a lot of it is just going to happen. And I think Trump feels he has a mandate. He feels it was a decisive victory. Democrats are in the minority. I mean, the Republican majority in the House and Senate is kind of thin, but Democrats are certainly going to try to be the resistance as best they can. But I think the public is of a mood to give Trump a chance and, to see if he can enact these priorities.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how much of a leeway he has to do all this. But thank you so much, Peter Nicholas.
Thank you, Mish.
And still to come, a revealing look at how some Senate Democrats in key battleground states were able to win despite Vice President Harris losing this election cycle. And as the early jockeying begins for the next one. Don't go anywhere. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. The results of this month's election were made clear, and it made clear that Democrats have a lot of work to do with battleground state voters. But despite the presidential headwinds, Senate Democrats in Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, and Arizona all came out on top, even though Vice President Kamala Harris lost each of those battleground states. So what really made the difference here? Joining me now to get at that answer to that question is NBC News senior national politics reporter Natasha Karecki. Natasha, it's great to see you. We do so many stories together, so happy to be on TV with you. So why were senators in these critical battleground states able to have success when Vice President Harris did not?
It is really fascinating to see what is going on, and we're learning more and more every day as we see more data and as more votes are coming. So even since last week, what we're learning now is that in a couple of these battleground states, Harris actually outperformed the Democratic Senate candidate who won. And that is because there was a severe undervote by Republicans down ballot. So people were going in, voting for Trump, and then not voting down below or crossing over. In some of these cases, in Washoe County, our great politics editor, Scott Bland, was able to drill down on some of these numbers. In Washoe County, there was evidence that that Jackie Rosen was able to get crossover voters in that case more successfully than Sam Brown was able to. Sam Brown lost by just a few percentage points behind Jackie Rosen, but Jackie Rosen actually ran behind Harris. So what we saw was, something fascinating. We're still going to be looking at this, but what each of those Senate candidates did was sort of, they were able to run on their records. They were able to point to, here's what we did, here's what we didn't do. Harris couldn't do that. Harris had to sever the ties from the Biden administration to try to push a new way forward, as she said. But people wanted change, and Trump was change.
It's really interesting, and I stopped in my tracks when I saw that note from you that said raw vote totals, where Harris had more raw votes than some of these Senate candidates. But I also want to ask you about the future of the Democratic Party. Where do things stand in the race for DNC chair and the direction of the party?
Sure. So there's a lot of activity going on DNC chair. We saw 2 or 3 people officially get in the race today or this week, and probably as we're speaking. So yeah, maybe today. But yes, we saw Martin O'Malley get in. We saw Ken Martin get in. Martin O'Malley, former governor of Maryland. Ken Martin is Minnesota party chair. Also has a long time record within the DNC, but we're hearing some other bigger names. Ben Wickler, Wisconsin party chair. Rahm Emanuel, blast from the past. He may come back. So there's a lot of stuff floating around right now. I think we're going to see a lot of push and pull. We're going to see some fault lines created here with, do we leave? Are Democrats? Yeah. Did they go too far to the left? Did they not? Do we need a new way forward? Is that Rahm Emanuel? Is he the past? So a lot of these fights are going to play out.
Yeah, in the last few seconds here, what about that 2028 debate?
It's coming fast and furious. We're seeing a lot of governors step up. People speaking on their behalves, J.B. Pritzker, Shapiro, Gavin Newsom. These are names that are getting thrown around already. So we're seeing that. Question is, do they need an outsider? Some people in the party think they do.
Yeah, well, so good to see you, Natasha. I'll see you on Slack, I'm sure. And we're back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. The news continues right now with Hallie Jackson.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.